Hang Tuah is undoubtedly a culturally relevant figure in Malaysia. Every Malaysian would remember learning about him in school or seeing the roads, buildings, and tourist attractions named after him. Around 2004, a fake email began spreading about supposed DNA evidence showing that Hang Tuah was ethnically Chinese, rather than Malay. And over the next decade or so, a series of debates began to flare up online about who he was. Was he a myth or a historical figure? And if so, was he Malay, Chinese, or some other racial ethnic background? In 2016, an article in Harian Metro revealed that out of the 5,000 manuscripts held in the National Library that were about Hang Tuah and the other warriors who lived during the 15th century, only 250 of them have been examined. That's 5%. These manuscripts don't even include the archival documents that are being held overseas. So, alright, no one really cares about what happened 500 years ago. It doesn't matter. Let's talk about all the more important problems that Malaysia has. But it does matter because this national myth is being used as a political weapon. It perpetuates the racial structures left behind during British colonial rule and widens the divide between Malaysians. When Malaysia gained its independence in 1963, Malaysia's first Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, called for unity between races when he said, "No one can say that it is a Malay government. It is an all-community government, a microcosm of people of Malaya." If you visit Museum Negara's Gallery of the Early Kingdoms, the first thing you'll see is a 2-meter high brass relief of Hang Tuah. The mural was commissioned by the museum director at the time, Mubin Shepherd. In 1963, the museum was generally featuring culture, arts, and history, nothing like the historical focus that we mean to see today. Shepherd was an Irish-born colonial officer who had a special interest in Malay culture. Before he was put in charge of the museum, he wrote a book called The Adventures of Hang Tuah, the first English translation of an already popular story. He drew inspiration from the oldest primary source written in 1536 about Hang Tuah, and Hikayat Hang Tuah, written a few hundred years later in 1700s in high praise of Hang Tuah. Shepherd's book further popularized the story, becoming the canon for the legend of Hang Tuah. The mural shows Hang Tuah holding his curse, called Tameng Seri, which is said to have made Hang Tuah invincible. He is wearing traditional Malay clothing, and the reliefs to his sides show the training he went through to become a warrior, and his heroic deeds. In the background, you can see the peaks of Gunung Ledang where he trained with his silat master, and the home of the magical princess, who the Sultan of Malacca tried to court with the help of Hang Tuah. The story of Hang Tuah is controversial, because he was sentenced to death by the Sultan of Malacca after being accused of carrying on illicit affairs with a court lady. But Hang Tuah was spirited away by a bendahara, or vizier, who kept him in hiding. Hang Tuah's friend, Hang Jebat, was enraged by the Sultan's actions and went on a rampage. The Sultan immediately regretted his decision to kill Hang Tuah, knowing that he was the only man powerful enough to stop Hang Jebat. Hang Tuah came out of hiding at this point and killed his friend in a duel. That sounds a little dubious to be history. It sounds more like a fairy tale. Yet, Hang Tuah stands confidently as the centerpiece of a history museum decades later. Shepherd took liberties in crafting the story of Hang Tuah. He chose events based on what he saw as Malaya's history and ironed out any discrepancies in the earlier texts, seemingly arbitrarily. Even the face we see for Hang Tuah was chosen by Shepherd. He picked 2 Malay soldiers who he felt conveyed the look of Hang Tuah and had an artist make a composite. The line between fact and fiction is blurred beyond recognition with this national myth. But the national myth and the mural seem relatively harmless until we look at the quote engraved at the top. Takkan Melayu hilang di dunia. Never will the Malays be wiped off. A more inclusive quote from Hikayat Hang Tuah, one of the earlier texts that I mentioned before, was, "We are Malays, but also kacakan, or mixed." This quote was also attributed to Hang Tuah. It emphasizes racial harmony and Malaysia's cultural multiplicity within the national myth. Hang Tuah not only representing Malays, but the people of Malaysia. Instead, the myth of Hang Tuah was used to elevate one racial group above all others. In the early years of Malaysia's independence, There were sparks of Malay nationalism that heralded Malays as the original settlers, the Bumiputra, which led to policies like the new economic policy that gave Bumiputra special rights to narrow the economic gap, a policy that continues to remain in place today. These categories of race that British colonial rule left behind when they attempted to eke out maximum profits from Malaya while leaving its people divided and weak created major rifts between the different racial groups. It reinforced how the people saw themselves, as us and them, even decades later. But there was a tension in claiming that Malays were the original settlers, when they are culturally, religiously, and ethnically different from the Orang Asli. The myth of Hang Tuah helped bolster the Malays' claims as Bumiputra because the narrative places Hang Tuah, who they identify as a member of their racial group, as a hero of Malaya's pre-colonial age. He was not to be confused with Malays in other countries, setting the Malays of Malaysia apart from those of countries like Indonesia or the Philippines. It distanced them from the idea that they were migrants into Malaysia like the Chinese or the Indians, and tried to endorse the claim that they were always in Malaysia. The myth wasn't fully politically weaponized until the 2000s by ultra-nationalist Malay movements. In 1999, 2,000 Chinese associations appealed to abolish the Bumiputra distinctions written into Malaysia's economic policies. But protests from UMNO members forced them to withdraw. 6 years later, during a general meeting of UMNO, the party's chairman, Hishamuddin Hussein, brandished the keris, a weapon associated strongly with Hang Tuah and the message of Malay heritage he brings with him. He did this to defend the idea of Malay supremacy. What started off as one man's curation of history morphed over the years to become a political weapon. The identity of the Malay community increasingly merged with Hang Tuah and distanced themselves from other racial groups. This is also around the time when we see the online debates begin to flare up, claiming that Hang Tuah was actually Chinese or Indian or Orang Asli. These debates were a bid for non-Malays to claim their place in Malaysia's history. The story of Hang Tuah has come under fire for endorsing blind loyalty to the state, choosing the Malacca Sultanate over his friend, even though the state had previously betrayed him. Compare this to Ismail Mustam's painting, where he depicts both warriors battling each other on equal footing. We don't know who is who, and we have no indication of who will win. The warriors are surrounded by spears, representing a participatory audience that reflect the artist's hopes for more engagement by the public in constructing national identity. This painting was completed in 1961, a year before the mural in Museum Negara. I believe that these debates on truth behind Hang Tuah is an attempt from the non-Malays in Malaysia to reimagine their story in relation to their homeland. Rather than being a minefield of insidious comments, the online forums reveal a desire to feel a part of Malaysia, to be treated as equals within its social structures. As one netizen puts it, I frankly don't see myself working in Malaysia in the future. The prospects are just too bleak for someone from a race considered as asing or foreign. To some, note that I say some, of those in power, I can understand why so many students from Malaysia left the country for places like Singapore, Australia, the US, and the UK. If we do learn the truth about Hang Tuah, what changes for us? For one thing, it would undermine the arguments for Malay supremacy. But in that vacuum, a new narrative will take its place. I believe that engaging with conversations about who we are as Malaysians will enable us to fill that space with a story that embraces our diversity and truly says, One Malaysia.